But let's continue talking about what the pituitary gland does. Have a reminder, we have an anterior pituitary gland, also called the adenohypophysis. Have a posterior pituitary gland, also called the neurohypophysis. We secrete two hormones that are released from the posterior pituitary gland, antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. They're actually made in the hypothalamus, but released into the posterior pituitary gland. Now, the anterior pituitary gland makes and releases these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 hormones. So the pituitary gland in all releases 9 hormones, but it makes and releases 7 from the front. But it only releases those when regulatory hormones that are made in the hypothalamus tells them to be made. Okay, now, what are they? Well, again, adrenocorticotropic hormone goes to the adrenal cortex. But something else is happening in the adrenal gland besides the adrenal cortex releasing the cortisol and also androgens. And that is actually, ladies, where you get your testosterone from. All right, but the other thing going on in the adrenal gland is the middle of the adrenal gland, the adrenal medulla, is releasing our epinephrine, norepinephrine, or otherwise known as adrenaline. Now, notice that we have a direct stimulation coming from the hypothalamus to the adrenal medulla. Notice that our ACTH is going actually to the adrenal cortex, because when we're in an emergency, we need this adrenaline released immediately, and we know neural stimulus is much faster than hormonal stimulus. Okay, so but we know hormones often goes to parts of the body to cause the release of other hormones, as we see in all these other examples. Okay, but as far as adrenaline is concerned, though, because it needs to be released almost immediately. And by the way, norepinephrine can also be a neurotransmitter, but because it's released from the adrenal medulla into the blood, then it is considered a hormone. And even the adrenal medulla is of a different tissue nature than the adrenal cortex. Kind of like the front of the pituitary gland is epithelial endocrine cells and the back is neural cells. Well, the tissue in the adrenal medulla is modified neurons versus the layers of the cortex around it. Okay, our next hormone we're going to talk about is thyroid stimulating hormone. And what this does, it stimulates the thyroid to release T3 and T4, thyroxine and triiodothyronine, these hormones that are there to help with metabolism. Okay, growth hormone triggers basically chemicals called somatometans to be released that stimulate growth in tissues. Now, most things can be affected by growth hormone because most things have some sort of growth cycle that is involved in their life cycle. But how come only thyroid stimulating hormone affects the thyroid? And the truth is, all of these are hormones, so they're all going in the blood. Where does the blood go in the body? Well, it goes everywhere. So the key is only the thyroid cells have receptors that actually bond with the thyroid stimulating hormone, whereas most cells, at least cells that have the ability to grow, have receptors for growth hormone. So again, the hormone goes all over the body, but it doesn't necessarily affect every part of the body. It affects whatever has receptors for that messenger, that chemical messenger, that hormone. Okay, we can see prolactin is what goes to stimulate the release of milk. Follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone are the gonadotropins, so they go to the gonads in both males and females to do different jobs. We see that obviously in the males they're going to go to the testes, and the females are going to go to the ovaries. Then the testes are going to produce testosterone and inhibin, and the ovaries are going to produce estrogen, progesterone, and inhibin. Okay, and then this is the melanocyte stimulating hormone. Does stimulate melanocytes, but and of course they're responsible for melanin, but as it says, uncertain significance in healthy adults. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about how these are released and the feedback loops that could be involved in the release of these. Here we see some different types of feedback loops. Let's look at this first one because it demonstrates something we were talking about. Notice that we have our hypothalamus, our infundibulum, and our pituitary gland here. Here we have the anterior lobe. So notice that the neurons here are going to release the regulatory hormone, and then that will make its way down to the anterior lobe to trigger whatever hormone it was for to be released. Now, notice if the regulatory, or in this case, releasing hormone, if it were thyrotropin releasing hormone, then it would go to the anterior pituitary and would cause it to then give hormone 1, which would be the thyroid stimulating hormone. Well, then that would go into the bloodstream. It would go to the thyroid gland and cause it to release hormone 2. And the hormone 2 that's released from the thyroid gland would be T3 and T4, the thyroid hormones. Okay, well, let's look at that same scenario again. What if we had CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone, which was made once there was a low level of that hormone? It was made in the hypothalamus because the hypothalamus is doing homeostasis. It's taking samples of whatever's going on in our body fluids, including the amounts of hormones. So if it, in this case, we're talking about the ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone. So if that level is low, then my hypothalamus is going to detect that. It's going to make corticotropin releasing hormone, which again is released into that portal blood system in the infundibulum, delivered to the anterior lobe. Now the anterior lobe starts making adrenocorticotropic hormone. And then when it's released into the bloodstream, then it is hormone 1, and it's going to go to the adrenal cortex, the outer part of the adrenal gland, where then it's going to trigger the adrenal gland to release hormone 2, hormone 2 being, in this case, the glucocorticoids, say like cortisol, and then cortisol then goes to the target cells, and that's what actually does the job for the body. But here's our way of getting it released. Now, again, we could follow the rest of these the same way. The gonadotropins, FSH and LH, are going to be controlled by the regulatory hormone, the gonadotropin releasing hormone, which again starts up here in the hypothalamus. Okay, then it's released, it triggers then either follicle stimulating or luteinizing or both to be released. So they would be hormone 1. They're going to go to the endocrine organ, which is going to be the testes and ovaries, according to obviously if it's male or female. And then they will release one of these hormones, and then these hormones will go do their job. So if it's androgens, if it's, let's say it's testosterone's released, then testosterone, the target cells could be muscles. And the androgen, the testosterone, could tell the muscles to start adding, more protein filaments in it. Okay, now, again, that's an example. Here, let's look at another example here where we have in this case, our regulatory hormones is both an inhibiting hormone and a releasing hormone. So what we have again is we have the growth hormone inhibiting hormone saying, well, don't make any more growth hormone. But if we have the growth hormone releasing hormone, then it's saying, yes, releases that hormone is released to the bloodstream, goes here, says make growth hormone. Now, the growth hormone goes to the liver, and then it it causes the liver to produce the somatomedins, which would actually then be released to the skeletal muscles, cartilage, and other tissues that definitely need growth, where growth hormone itself can directly go to the epithelial or adipose tissue or to the liver itself. Now, if we have a lot of the somatomedins, then what's going to happen is, then because we have a lot, then once all this is circulating through our blood and our hypothalamus is kind of taking samples of all our body fluids, then once it says, oh, you've got a lot of somatomedins, so you don't need so many, so then it's going to trigger this to release the growth hormone inhibiting hormone, which will then inhibit the release of growth hormone. Okay, so again, negative feedback loop going on here. There are some things that are actually positive feedback loops that actually occur, especially in what's going on for preparing for the development of a baby, and we'll look at that a little bit later when we talk about the reproductive system. Okay, here we have a real important chart from your book, and it's a chart I often use on tests, and I'll explain it to you, then I'll explain how I might use it on a test. Okay, so look at our categories here. First of all, we have the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. So here's the hormones that we just talked about released from the anterior lobe, or actually on down through here. And then we have the posterior lobe. So here are those two hormones, antidiuretic hormone, oxytocin, that's released from the posterior pituitary gland. Okay. Now, then what we actually have is we have, besides the hormones, we have, well, where do the hormones go? What's their target organ or gland? And then what is it that those hormones end up doing? Okay, but our furthest category over here to the right is actually where everything starts. Maybe if I had made this this chart out myself, I might have started with this one or put it first next to the hormone. But this is our regulatory hormone. In other words, these are the hormones that for the anterior pituitary are the ones that tell these hormones to be released from the anterior pituitary. Now remember, here we don't have regulatory hormones telling us to release antidiuretic or oxytocin. They are actually made in the hypothalamus. Their hypothalamic origin is in the hypothalamus, so they're not going to have a regulatory hormone involved in them. They're just going to be released, made in the hypothalamus, released in the neurohypophysis, the posterior pituitary. All right, but so just giving an example, and then you look at this chart, pause it, do whatever you need to, look at this chart. Notice that we have the thyrotropin releasing hormone, which is released to the anterior pituitary through the portal system in the infundibulum, saying to make thyroid stimulating hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone then goes to the thyroid gland and causes it to secrete thyroid hormones, T3 and T4. All right, notice corticotropin releasing hormone. It is released into the bloodstream into that portal bloodstream in the infundibulum from the hypothalamus. It goes to the anterior pituitary, and it causes the anterior pituitary to release adrenocorticotropic hormone, which then goes to the adrenal cortex of the adrenal gland, a specific area called the zona fasciculata. Okay, then it causes that adrenal gland to then secrete the glucocorticoids, especially cortisols. I mean, when we'll be talking about. Okay. Next, notice you've got the gonadotropin releasing hormone, which is a regulatory hormone, and notice that it is going to go to the gonadotropins, which is the follicle stimulating hormone and the luteinizing hormone. Okay. Now, again, if it's follicle stimulating hormone, it's going to go to the follicle cells of the ovaries, which cause the secretion of estrogen and also follicle development, therefore the name follicle stimulating hormone. In the males, it's going to go to the sustentacular cells, which are going to cause stimulation of sperm maturation. Okay. Now, luteinizing hormone, which is also triggered by the gonadotropin releasing hormone, is going to go also to the follicle cells of the ovaries, and it's actually what stimulates ovulation, which is the release of the egg from the follicle, and formation of the corpus luteum, which is what's left over of that structure, the follicle. Okay, and also causes the secretion of progesterone, which we'll talk more about that again when we do the rest of the reproductive system. Okay, in males, though, luteinizing hormone goes to the interstitial cells of the testes and then causes the secretion of testosterone. All right, then we have prolactin releasing factor and prolactin releasing factor and prolactin inhibiting hormone, which prolactin causes production of milk. Sometimes we need it released, sometimes we need it inhibited. So obviously this is going to be something that is going to be triggered on special occasions, especially a baby suckling on the nipple will actually send signals to the brain, to the hypothalamus, that will cause it to start releasing prolactin releasing factor, and then that will go to, of course, to the anterior pituitary. That will be released, go to the mammary glands, trigger those apocrine cells to start producing milk.